So let's start off by looking at lines, and let's talk about how to break down a betting line. We're going to take a line from week 5 of the 2020 NFL season, and just grabbing one at random, we'll look at the Jacksonville Jaguars plus 6.5 and the Houston Texans with a total of 54. Both teams are relatively healthy and have been so far for most of the season. What's interesting is that on the season, Houston has averaged 20 points and Jacksonville 23.8. Clearly, something must be going on defensively, so let's look into that. If we look across the season so far, Houston has given up 31.5 points per game and Jacksonville 29.2. So the first thing you want to notice here is that even with home field advantage, which is much less valuable this season due to smaller crowds or no crowds, Houston should not be 6.5 point favorites. And personally, on gut feeling level, I would have Houston at around 27 points and Jacksonville at around 26 points without digging into it too much. Now, how do we know that? Well, for that, we are gonna have to dig more into it. These numbers are based upon only 4 weeks of sample size. Going into the season, the Texans were projected at 7.5 wins and the Jaguars only 4.5. Houston also recently fired their head coach and GM, who, according to a lot of NFL analysts, has been one of the worst head coaches in the NFL for many years. Assuming that his replacement is superior and that the team will be motivated heavily to get a win for their new head coach, the line is starting to make more sense than it did after an initial view. On paper, Houston seems to be a slightly to significantly worse team than last season in terms of creating yards, but their yards per play is up compared to last season, 5.9 versus 5.8 in 2019. They've been a bit unlucky on turnover disparity, which is something important to look at, especially fumbles. They've had a fairly normal 60% touchdown rate in the red zone. They just haven't gotten into the red zone as much as they did last season, 2.5 times per game as opposed to 3.5 in 2019. So you can expect at least a little positive regression there. Now, on the defensive side, Houston is actually giving up 5.8 yards per play, which is less than last year. So in theory, they should be giving up fewer points, and their defense might be simply getting unlucky. Regarding Jacksonville, they've outperformed expectations all around. They've been tremendously lucky scoring touchdowns in the red zone, 71% this season as opposed to 40% last season. And their total yardage is up 25 yards per game. Their yards per play are also up substantially. But then on defense, it's a whole other story. The Jaguars are giving up more yards per play than the year before, and they are giving up about 5 more points per game than they were last season. So it looks like their defense has been a bit unlucky as well. Both teams rank near the lowest in the league in terms of possessions per game and plays per game, which makes sense because as of week 5, they were a combined 1-7. Both of these teams rank amongst the highest in the league in passing percentage versus rush percentage. They both were effectively forced to throw the ball to try to come back in games, and both teams are currently running the ball significantly less than they were last season. Okay, let's put all this information together. We've looked at both of the teams who are both struggling, especially the Jacksonville defense and Houston offense, which are both underperforming from last season. The total points for the game, according to our sports books, is 54. We would probably lean heavily on the under 54 because in 2019, these teams averaged a combined 43 points per game and gave up a combined 52. Houston, provided it gets a lead, will probably play a very run-heavy attack, and their receivers are mostly short gainers with the exception of Will Fuller. It's pretty unlikely that either team will win by a large margin, and it's even more unlikely for this game to be some crazy high-scoring game. In terms of picking a side or playing the point spread market, as I just said, we have this game being pretty close regardless of who wins, but would probably look to play Jacksonville plus 6.5, but maybe stay on the fence hoping for a plus 7 to pop off somewhere. Overall, Jacksonville has gotten slightly better and Houston slightly worse overall, but I am far more interested on betting in that under 54. Remember, when you're planning on two teams to underperform, you shouldn't necessarily expect the team to perform to their average in the point spread as well. Things like game flow, previous season stats, and coaching staff are important elements you want to look at when judging a team. Later on in this course, we'll go through more of these elements, stuff like strength of schedule, situational matchups, and so on. In our next part, we're going to go over some tricks of the trade and tools used by pro handicappers that you might not think to use at first glance. Until then, I'm Pat Stouffer. Thanks for watching.